Welcome to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. We provide fiction reviews for the lit, curious reader, because why not try a little of everything? Our scholarish approach and cozy book club atmosphere makes literature accessible to everyone. Whether you're a casual reader or a devoted bookworm, join us on our literary journey to explore all genres. Welcome back to another episode of the Extra Literary Affairs, where Jennifer and I are going to have an affair with each other again. Again. Wow, we're really just loving it.
This is
having
starting to
affair.
become a habit, Joey. This is a habit.
We shouldn't do this. We have to stop doing this. Today, we're going to do a March reading wrap up. So, we're going to start doing a monthly reading wrap up at the end of every month. We're going to talk about each of the stories that we read, and we're going to answer some questions about our reading and what we loved, what we didn't love, and things that we're excited to look ahead for. Do you have anything you want to add before we begin there, Jennifer?
No, Joey, I'm really excited that this is our first monthly reading wrap up, and I look forward to revisiting some of the amazing stories that we read and listened to and discussed in March.
Let's start with the first one. So, what was your favorite story that we read this month, and why did it stand out to you?
Joey, you know I hate the question, what is your favorite? A mother cannot pick her favorite child. They are all my favorites for all different reasons. So
But if you have to pick,
if I had to pick, I think I am going to go with, I think The Witch, because I've just talked about it so much that felt like the most fun experience recording the podcast and the story. But each of the stories, and I would like to note, thank you so much for the month of March. For us, we only read female authors, and that was very interesting to see authors from different time frames, from different countries, writing in different languages, having translations. It just felt like a really great way to focus in on some themes that were resonating with us. So I just wanted to note that I think my favorite part about the month of March and the things that we did is that we really were exposing, at least me, to people I have never read before. And that was really great.
what about the story, The Witch, stood out to you? Because obviously you were saying like you've been discussing this outside of our podcast, is what you mean. But like what in the story or what part of our recording or our discussion, because obviously that was when we had Chris, what was the standout?
I think the standout for me was that, as you may recall, we had a conversation with another party who did not appreciate our interpretation of this man's behavior being so abhorrent. And it really was a great experience to listen to other perspectives, having other people say, well, maybe there's another explanation for why this person did it. And the turning on the head of the story from Shirley Jackson's point of view of the little boy thinking witches could be women. Like, I have been socialized that I know what a witch is, right? Like from the Wicked Witch of the West. I think that I have an idea as a person born in a certain time and place of what a witch is based on the culture that I have consumed. And so when the little boy said, maybe that man is a witch, I really appreciated that. And the one question that came up for me that someone had asked, you never defined what a witch is. And we never really got that question answered. And so I think that is something that's still, for me, the mark of a good story is if I want to think about it and talk about it more after we record our podcast. And this is a story that just keeps haunting me with the what was she doing? What did she want us to take away from that? And was it just a playful kids romp of I'm just a precocious little boy and I'm going to believe everything in fantasy land can also happen in real life?
And you did get some feedback from some viewers for The Witch. Is there anything that we should discuss while we're on the topic?
So I had a really interesting take from someone who challenged me to think perhaps the old man was not describing the murder and dismemberment of his sister, but he really was recalling doing that to a doll. Like he could take the head off and he could rip the nose off and he could take the hair off and he could do all of these
Mr.
things.
Potato Head style.
yeah, that just felt like, oh, well, that's a generous reading of this story. And it
Hmm.
would explain why, and you brought this up in our podcast, how come he says he killed his sister and then he killed his sister and then he killed his sister again. He's like had all of these multiple killings of his sister. And you're like, dead is dead is dead. Like you don't get multiple tries on this goal. Like you just have to do it once. And it's like, well, if it's a doll and it is make believe and let's pretend, you can do it all the ways. So I just thought that was an interesting way to have somebody bring that up for me of challenging me on the validity of everyone's point of view, right? And I really appreciate that. It's like I have my perspective and hearing from other people about their challenges to our story. And another person sent in a note to me and said, do you know that, historically, people who were accused of witchcraft or persecuted or burned at the stake or whatever we're categorizing those, like maybe
Hmm.
1/3 of them were men. So I have a historical bias that is not necessarily correct, that I was like, no, witches are women. Like we all know that. And it's like, well, not technically, according to historical fact. So I thought that was just really interesting. And maybe the most interesting thing about this, Joey, is that it did engage the audience and people wanted to talk and give feedback on it. And we really
Hmm.
relish that. And I would super encourage anyone who had questions or comments or factual corrections, or you just think we don't know what we're talking about. We also love to hear that. Honestly, we do.
Constructive criticism. Keep your nasty comments to yourself. It
That goes without saying, but thank God Joey
doesn't.
said it.
Not on Beyonce's internet. Doesn't.
Oh, I
Um,
forgot we're on the internet. We're not just talking to
we're
our
on
friends.
Beyonce's internet. Yes, that's true.
Yes.
You don't get it. You didn't get my. That's okay.
Joey, I know you just shake your head when you look at me and you're like, could she get one single
Well, you know
popular
who
reference
Beyonce is.
ever?
Okay,
I
but anyway.
do.
All right. Anyway, yeah, I do like that idea of what if this man was describing a doll and not his actual sister. And I think that's a good like what we have come to term as conspiracy theory because there's no textual evidence that that's true. But it's open to it's I don't know. I don't know that that one is open so much to interpretation for me at least. I certainly didn't read it like that, and I don't know that there's real like I've read that story many a time now, and I don't think that there's any indication to suggest that it's a doll other than an adult reading it with a more logical mind like that person was. It's more logical to assume it's an inanimate object and not a person. But interesting nonetheless. It's fun to hear what other people think could be happening, but I don't know that it's supposed to be super logical, especially if we think about Shirley Jackson's all of her body of work is like there's a lot of supernatural elements in it, so it sort of like makes sense for her to have this sort of magical realism, I guess, in this case.
And it's always transgressive, right? It's
Yeah.
never the straightforward story that you're like, oh, and everybody goes home happy. It's like, nope, somebody's going to die and it's going to be horrific. I'm like, okay, good. Thanks for the update.
Yeah. So, well, you know what? There's this story called Paranoid that is an amazing story by Shirley Jackson. We should read that one. That really isn't supernatural. But anyway, it doesn't matter. All right. Moving on. Moving on. For me, my favorite story this month was all of them, I also say. But I can't say that. I have to pick one. But I loved every single story that we have read, especially since we moved to our extra literary affairs branding. But the standout for me was Bloodchild by Octavia E. Butler because it first of all it introduced me to her writing. I had already known who she was, of course, because I don't live under a rock. But I had never read any of her work. And so this really inspired me to go on and read some of her other books. I have more of her books now, but I have since read The Parable of the Sower, which I think I might have already read that during that podcast recording. Doesn't matter. Anyway, so I still have to read Parable of the Talents, but I have some other of her work now that I'm excited to continue in reading. But what stood out to me was that how it made me reconsider childbirth as a cisgender homosexual man. That was an interesting thing because I would not naturally like contemplate having to witness childbirth. Obviously, I am a cisgender man, so that is not going to happen. I do not have ovaries. I cannot produce children. So I was never going to personally push a child out of my vagina, but I was also never going to really see it. I have an older sister. I'm not going to be in the room if she ever had a kid. So no, thank you. But it really made me think like, oh my God, how traumatic it must be. And I said this in the podcast as well. Like, how much traumatic must it be for a person who can have children, who has ovaries, is having to look at this sometimes it's usually a movie, like a not a movie, a documentary of a woman giving birth IRL, okay? And like being like, that's your future if you want it, of course, okay? But the assumption for women is they have to have kids. But anyway, like you are forced to watch childbirth. Some horrific stuff can happen to your body in childbirth, as everyone's aware. So it really made me sit and think like, what does that do to somebody that has to sit there and look at that and learn about like at a medical sort of, well, as much as you will be able to learn as a teenager medically in that, but like you're having to understand so much about it, and then they're expecting you to just be okay with that. And the main character here obviously sees it and immediately tries to commit suicide. So I was like, damn, that has stuck with me.
So, Joey, I love that you brought that up because that was, you know, a five-way tie for number one first place of my favorite stories, which I know you're like, that's not allowed. I'm like, okay.
No, I get
That
it.
the second, I loved Blood Child, but I think the Husband Stitch jumped up in the rankings for me because when you asked me to contemplate, like, what was the most, like, what had the most impact on you? What's the character or the scene that really resonates when you think about all the things we read in March? And I was drawn to the story that you had talked about, Blood Child, of course, men being slit open so the little grubs that were being incubated in them could get out. I'm like, yeah, that was pretty gross, but not as effective as I felt that in The Husband Stitch, the author gave these stage directions to us reading the story that she wrote. And she's like, so just take a random member of the audience and hold up the little part of your hand and ask them to just slice it
Oh
open
yeah.
and then say thank you for slicing my hand. And I was like, the way that she described it, which is way grosser than the way that I have described it, was so visceral and so moving. It's like, nobody's going to be okay with that. Like, you never hand a scalpel or jagged knife to some random person. You're like, can you just cut me in a really delicate place? And then I'll say, I'm so grateful for you doing that for me. Oh, thank you so much. I'm like,
Your
no,
hand crotch.
nobody's doing it. Nobody's doing it. And that really stuck with me. But it was also interesting as we were looking at the way the stories kind of stacked up about bodily autonomy, about consent, about childbirth, about who gets to decide what your boundaries are. And I just thought that was so interesting because that even came into the Sally Rooney story of
Hmm.
Mr. Salary. Like that was definitely in there. And the witch, not so much because we didn't have any physical horror, but it was also, oh yeah, it's okay to kill your sister. No big deal. Like, fine. Like, what? That is a screwed up message for any child. This is not the fairy tale world that I want to participate in.
Hmm. It's interesting that the two scenes that, or each of the scenes that stuck out for each of us has to do with childbirth in some way. So I mean, it's pretty visceral. And that one from Carmen Maria Machado, yes, that was I forgot about that. That she calls that out and says this is her call. This is basically her call to action in the story. Yeah, that was gross. But yeah, the scene that stuck out to me the most was the one I was just describing, where the protagonist has to watch a birth, a childbirth process, and is exposed to the truth of what that will actually be for him in the future, and he's aware that he has to do it. There's no getting out of it. There's a serious imbalance in their relationship that he doesn't have choice. So yes, interesting that it was both childbirth. That's
And
both
very
fucked us
interesting,
up.
Joey, because neither one of us biologically
Mhm.
will be able to complete this task. So it's
Mhm.
interesting that reading about this gave us an experience that we ourselves will never physically have, but it was
Yeah.
so relatable and so horrific. And yeah, I'm kind of like, thanks for being spared. I'm very happy that I will not be experiencing the miracle of childbirth
Yeah.
as illustrated in either of these two stories. I'm sure it's a beautiful, wonderful, magical thing, but it's just not for us.
Even though I tell my dog I gave birth to him, but he doesn't know how that happened.
Well, he doesn't
Okay.
know you didn't. He does not know you
He
didn't.
doesn't know. Yeah, that's true. I can lie to him all I want. Okay. Did you have any unexpected disappointments or surprising favorites from this month? And disappointments, it doesn't, because obviously we loved all the stories, but maybe there was something that in the story was like, oh, I wish this was a little different.
I think that there was nothing that I went, oh, I really wish the story would have ended differently. I think multiple times in our readings and listenings and discussing, we're like, oh, I wish I knew the rest of the story. What's the rest of the
Mhm.
story? So I think that is a continuous theme between you and I of, hey, loved everything you wrote, but I have questions and I need to
Mhm.
know what's going to happen next. And I think that is a very beautiful gift that authors can leave us with, that we can engage our own imagination. We can debate it amongst ourselves. Well, what in this world, what do you want to have happen? And I think the interesting thing for me also, which was so clear, was this idea of world building. These authors, the science fiction in particular, even Shirley Jackson, who was not science fiction, but she is telling us the way the world works. We hear about the way the world works. What is appropriate to tell a child? What is inappropriate to tell a child? These things are clearly articulated to us. And I was like, isn't that interesting? And the biggest surprise for me, Joey, was reading Bloodchild and being like, science fiction, really, Joey? Come on, I don't want to do this. And I was like, oh my God, I love it so much. When can we do more? And I was listening to the podcasts today just because I was like, I wanted to revisit some of these moments. And I had to laugh at myself because I'm like, oh, Joey, you ask often, it's like, is this a love story? I'm like, yeah. So every horror story I somehow think is a love story, and every love story turns into a horror story in my lens. So I just thought that was also an interesting snapshot of perhaps where my psyche is in this moment. So I think my biggest surprise was how much I appreciated the science fiction aspects of Octavia E. Butler's story, Bloodchild, because it was all the stuff I love. It was empathy, it was family relationships, it was personal choice, it was all the things. And I was like, oh, right, science fiction can be a deep, rich literary experience. And just because that had not been my experience in the past doesn't mean that those great works aren't out there. So thanks, Joey, for just bringing that front and center.
Yeah, I think we have talked about in the past too the difference between genre and literary fiction and how sometimes there can be, or it's a very blurred line between them. And I think Octavia E. Butler is a great example of that because what you would assume just by like reading the summary of one of her stories that she's genre fiction because she's writing about humans in on an alien planet, or she wrote about vampires and stuff like that, or dystopian fiction, like in The Parable of the Sower and Talons. But then once you get to reading her work, you're like, oh, this is literary fiction packaged in genre fiction, in science fiction. So, and it's just like I love that was your experience with that because that's what I was hoping was like, oh, you get it, you get it that like that's a possibility. And I'm not saying that happens for all science fiction or high fantasy or fantasy of any level, where there's plenty of stuff where it's just like this is going to be a good time. Like one of my favorite high fantasy novels is called Kings of the Wild, Nicholas Ames. And you're not going to I mean like there's a lot of fun stuff that's happening, but it's mostly high fantasy. Like it's not going to be like an Octavia E. Butler kind of thing. But my point is not only to just bring that point up that I love that book and everyone should read it. And also if you're listening to if you ever listen to this, Nicholas Ames, okay, if someone could send this to him, please tell him to hurry up and write that third book already. Oh my God. Anyway, that there is a lot of potential for us to explore genre fiction. And we've read like Stephen King. I'm said Stephen Hawking, very different. Stephen King, where it was a horror story, but there was so much more to it. So I'm excited for us to continue doing that.
I really appreciate that, Joey. And that's a hard no for me on high fantasy. But I've said hard no
Never say
before.
never.
So you just never know. I am very open to that. And yeah, if we get an opportunity to explore some stories like that in the future, I think I should keep an open mind. We ask our listeners, right, to step out of their literary comfort zone, and I should allow myself to be pleasantly surprised or, do the battle to the death of like why this was the worst book I ever, ever, ever had to read. Joey Kelly, why did you do that? I'll never get that time back. So yeah, that could
No,
also be fun.
I would suggest something. I don't have anything off the top of my head right this minute, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I plan on bringing in more of those things because you were also like, no, I don't like horror. And then we read a bunch of horror and you were like, I like horror.
Who
So,
knew?
and then same thing with science fiction. You're like,
There's a market, I guess, in my
whole
brain
new world.
to look at things that I previously had discounted. And I do want to just mention something that we have talked about in our classics episode about how to read classics and like why you should do that. And I don't think we did that in March, but it's still on the top of my brain that don't read stuff you don't like. Life is short. Read books, read things that light you up and make you think about the world in a different way. And I really appreciate the flexibility that you and I have with each other to say, this story just wasn't for me. I'm sure it's for someone, but it's not for me. And so I
Mhm.
really appreciate that we can have candid conversations like that.
Now I should answer the question that I just asked you. Went off on a tangent, but that's okay. So I didn't have any unexpected disappointments because, as I said, I loved them. I loved all of them. Thank the Lord because I don't want to read a story I don't like. But surprising favorites, I will say Clarice Lispector and The Smallest Woman in the World. Now, I didn't rank that as my all-time my favorite of the month, but it did make me really curious about Clarice Lispector. Not even just her body of work, but her life is very interesting, as we explored in that episode. But I really enjoyed her writing, and her storytelling, and I read The Hour of the Star. I'm excited to keep reading and reading more of her short fiction as well because she does have quite a few of them. So I am excited to keep doing that. Okay.
Joey, can I amend my answer?
Okay.
Because I just remembered something that was very disappointing, like
Oh.
hugely disappointing.
Okay.
It was about the Clarice Lispector story.
Uh-huh.
I had
Very nervous
downloaded a
day.
copy of it off of the internet, and the translation was the worst ever. It was so bad. And I was like, Joey, this story is unreadable. I do not know why we're doing this. Then I magically was like, oh, maybe I should try. Maybe I have a translation problem. And so I picked up a version by Elizabeth Bishop of that story. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so good. So just a reminder to self, sometimes the internet, serves up a big old pile of poo, and it may not be the best thing. You might need to either pay for content or go to a more reputable source. Or in the case of, she wrote this in Portuguese and it had been translated, translators count, right? It's like you really need to
Hmm.
pick somebody who can clearly articulate in a way that will be understandable to you in the language that you are currently speaking. So that was,
Hmm.
I think, the biggest disappointment for me that turned into a silver lining because then I was like, I love the story once I got my hands on that beautiful translation.
Yeah, good point. And we did talk about that in our classics episode, which we did do this month. I know it's really hard to keep track of when they're, trust me, I've been fixing the calendar and it's a real pain in the ass. But yeah, in our classics episode, we were talking about the importance of translations and finding, if you can, a translator that you meshed well with. And I was talking about Constance Garnett and how I only read Dostoevsky when she's translated it because I don't like the other translators. They just do not. I'm not saying that they're bad. I have no idea. I can't speak Russian and I don't read and then I don't read Russian. So it's double whammy. So I don't know. I'm sure that they're doing a perfectly great job. But for me and my reading sensibility and how I process information, the other translators just don't it doesn't compute for me. And that's okay. We can try other translations.
And Joy, I think it's fascinating that you would say that because obviously these translators in Russian. They all read Russian. They all speak
Mm,
Russian. They're all reading the same Russian text. But
hmm.
magically, they come up with totally different styles, different cadences, different word choices. And you're like, how do you get to decide? I'm like, I guess that's what translation is. And just as
Hmm.
I was listening to you talk about it, I'm like, oh, that's what we do on this podcast. We translate English stories into English.
Yeah.
We put them into other terms,
Yeah.
other words. We are translating for people who may not have read the original source. So I just thought that was kind of a playful, fun thing because I'm like, oh, exactly how Joey and I can read a sentence and be like, oh, that was so beautiful. And you're like, that didn't make any sense to me. Or like, they're not talking about flowers, Jennifer. They're talking about fireworks. I'm like, what? No, Joey. And it's like, oh, maybe. And so having that moment where we even as native English speakers, as our primary and only language, even we can't always agree on exactly what an image means or a particular word choice of like, well, why do you think they use that word instead of a different word? And yeah, I just think that's fascinating. So I'm really enjoying my English to English translation job. It's great.
I have translated from different types of English, like Old English, Middle English, and stuff like that, but we have not done that here. Okay.
And you also, Joey, don't sell yourself short. You also translate millennial English into Jennifer language. So that is like a very, very specific job skill. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for trying.
Yeah, I'll keep trying, see if it sticks. Okay, next question. What's one story you're excited to read this month?
I am really excited to read Margaret Atwood's Happy Endings. I think that is going to be awesome. I'm really excited to discuss that.
That makes sense. Okay, I'm excited to read The Lady in the Looking Glass by Virginia Woolf because I'm a recent wolf head. So like
A wolfie? I'm not sure
a
even what they're
wolfie.
called. That is horrible, Joey. If
That's
she was here, she
hilarious.
is rolling in her grave. I'm like, come on, guys. I gave you
Wolfie.
all the words, and
No,
that's what you came up with.
you would like that. Okay, I we're wolfies. I love that. Okay. Is that like a wolf scholar, which is probably, I mean, we're not wolf scholars, obviously, but whatever. We'll be wolfies. That'll be her fan club, is we're wolfies. So I'm really excited to read and discuss The Lady in the Looking Glass because I do love Virginia Woolf now. Eventually, we will be reading The Waves by Virginia Woolf. It'll be the first novel that we discuss. We'll be doing that in May. So everyone look out for that if you've read The Waves or you want to read it ahead of time. Please do. I was going to also add the reason why I'm so excited to read Virginia Woolf is because I literally just read A Room of One's Own. I finished it this afternoon. And oh my goodness, no wonder why everyone doesn't stop talking about it still to this day. It's amazing. Everyone should read it. It's like a little over 100 pages. Just read it. It'll take such a short thing and it will enrich your whole life forever. And I would love to discuss that one.
Yeah, Joey, I was just like, sign me up. That would be great. And it's a
Have you
book of
read that one yet?
essays. I have not read that yet.
Oh my God, so good.
And I think that one of the things that we have always embraced here on this podcast is that we are willing to try short stories, flash fiction, poetry. Let's do
Mhm.
some essays. Let's do a novel. Like, there are really no limits on the written word. The only thing I've kind of given a teeny little baby pushback on, let's be honest, it was like a big, big, giant person's pushback, is that I'm not quite sure that I'm ready to explore a graphic novel with you. But hey, stranger things have happened. So I will keep an open mind. So, yes, let's read A Room of One's Own and discuss that maybe over the summer.
I think it's a good one. Even though it's supposed to be two different essays, there maybe it was just the version that I read was just in chapters, so it didn't separate what the essay was, and it felt like it should be one anyway. But anyway, doesn't matter. Okay, so last question is outside of our podcast, what are some stories, some short stories, or books you're hoping to read, or you are currently reading? Maybe you're currently reading some stuff.
So, Joey, I had a friend who asked me, do you ever read any smut books on your podcast? I'm like, no,
No.
I don't, but that sounds great. Give me one. So, she had gifted me Alice Feeney's book, Beautiful Ugly. And I haven't had a chance to start it yet, but I'm excited just to literally step out of the world that I am normally in to see what that experience is like. So that is the next thing
A lot of
on my
sex.
wow, okay, bonus.
Well,
Loving
that's what
it.
makes it smutty is that it's sex. A lot of
Well,
sex.
my friend is so kind to me that she wouldn't spell out sex to me. And she just like, just read it and you'll find out yourself. And
Prude.
then I will be shocked. No, she thinks I'm the prude. So I was just like, I don't know, maybe Jennifer needs this book. I'm like, maybe I do need this book.
Maybe you do. You
And
need to have your sexual awakening.
I do. Well, An Awakening is also a Kate Chopin. Weren't we talking? Oh, we were talking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
Mansfield. Yeah. So it's like, oh, The Awakening
We
is
weren't
right
talking
in
about
my
her, but yeah,
bookshelf.
that is one.
Yeah. But I will not be reading that. And
So you're gonna be reading smut. That's fun.
yeah,
I
so
have nothing against it. I have
that's going to
nothing
be the
against that.
first thing I read. Oh, and I am listening to an audiobook, which counts as reading,
Duh.
which is so amazing. And it is about Captain James Cook, who was a famous explorer, as we know, in the 1700s.
I do
And
not know anything about him, but you have talked about him a lot lately, so now I
I am
have to figure it out.
he's kind of my guy. And this one is called The Wide Sea. And I have listened to various bits of it. And it is a beautiful story of the consequence of global expansion, of who gets the right to determine their own destiny. What was Captain Cook up to? Like, what did he think he was doing at the start of his career and what actually happened? And yeah, I'm a huge fan. And as you, yeah, I'll just leave it there. I'm a huge fan of that historical perspective that someone from a modern lens is looking back on these documents and these artifacts and creating a new story out of them. And it's not historical fiction. This is a factual retelling to the best of this author's knowledge of the things that happened. I'm kind of doing the spectrum. So there's a sexy, smutty book, and there's also a wow, was this a net positive or a net negative? And do we blame Captain Cook for what he did? Or was, if it wasn't him, it was going to be the next guy who got in a ship and said, let's see what's over there. So, just a very interesting thing about personal responsibility and kind of that butterfly effect. You do one little thing in one part of the country and you don't know what the downstream effect is going to be 200, 300 years hence.
I guess I have to read this because you're a fan. So I
I will
gotta figure
not
it
stop
out.
talking about it. It's like, and that's not even my favorite book about him, but I will save that for another time.
It's
Maybe that's
from
our
the synopsis, it seems like he was kind of a dick. Like he
he
like helped colonialism and the
he was
possible genocide of indigenous people.
yeah, he was hardcore on that, but I really believe in my heart of hearts because this is how I roll that in the end he regretted it. And one of the things that he really did regret was being beaten to death by the native Hawaiians on the island, on the big island of Hawaii. So
Sounds like
um
karma to me.
it all worked itself out in the end. It's like I
Okay.
think you picked the wrong guys to deal with today. The
Yeah,
end.
I guess I'm gonna have to read it or find like a. I'm sure there are like documentaries and see if I can form an educated opinion because I have a feeling I know what my opinion would be.
How about you, Joey? What are you reading? What's on your nightstand?
I don't have any smutty books on my nightstand. I tried to read a smutty book the other day and there ended up being no smut in it. So, I was waiting. Just like,
Did I
okay.
write it?
Okay, anyway, I'm not reading that, but I do have a lot of physical books. I probably have over 1,000 by now that I own at home, which is way too many.
And
So
for
I have
those
a
listening at home, Joey does not live in a library. He
no.
does not. He is creating one, but he does not live in one currently.
There's books in literally every single room except for my bathroom, only because they'll get messed up, obviously, if there's like, from the water damage. Okay, but right now I'm currently reading The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. I always loved the Disney adaptation. I don't remember the actors' names that are in it anyway. Michael Sheen is in it. Wait, is that his name? Michael Sheen? I don't know. He was like in Two and a Half Men.
Martin Sheen?
Martin Sheen?
Charlie Sheen.
Charlie Sheen.
We are
I don't
spectacular,
know. Anyway, he's
spectacular
in it.
bad.
He's in that adaptation that Disney did, and I loved it as a kid. And so I wanted to read The Three Musketeers because I did not like the Count of Monte Cristo. I thought it was boring. Maybe I should try again. I read it quite a few years ago, maybe like 5 years ago. So maybe I'll try again. But it's really fun, The Three Musketeers. It's just it feels like slapstick comedy to me. It's really like silly and it's like hyperbolic, and it's just supposed to be fun. I don't consider it literary. I think he did important things in literature, but I wouldn't say it's like super elevated in that way. Sorry to anybody that feels different. But anyway, so I'm currently reading that, and I'm also slowly reading Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois. It's like 700 pages, so it's a huge ass book. It's really well written, obviously, because Du Bois wrote it, but it's very dense and there's a lot of information. So I want to read it slowly so that I absorb all of it. And so far, all I can think is like, wow, my goodness, nothing has changed. So that sucks. That's depressing. But hopefully, if we all read it, then we can, make sure that this stuff is not continuously happening. But anyway, aside from that, I want to read another duo, or not another, because I have only read a trilogy. I want to read a duology by N.K. Jemisin, which I own now. And I have a weird love for French playwrights. I do not know what is it about them. I really got to like dig in and be like, what are all these elements? Because there's like five or six I can think off the top of my head where I'm like, I love them. I love them. I want to read everything they ever wrote. So right now I'm reading a lot of Molière, and he was a 17th century French playwright, and he has his most famous one is Tartuffe, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of, but he has one called Don Juan. It's so funny. Like literally all of his plays make me laugh out loud. I LOL IRL. Okay. it's it's so funny. Like it's like all of them get my humor. Like Jean Genet, Alfred Jarret, all of them. They all get these are from different times, but and Moliere. They all get my sense of humor, and I just can't get enough of them. I just like have read so many of his plays now.
Joey, I love that because there's a laugh track going in my head, supplied by you. And I was like, you were putting off all of these French names. I'm like, Calais is
Yeah.
not French. So
No.
you get that humor with them. I appreciate that, as you said, 1700s was 300 years ago. And this still makes you laugh out loud because it's still humor is humor is humor. Like some things don't age, but I love that for you. And so maybe you can convince me to read and discuss one of these plays because that's something we have not done on this
Yeah.
podcast.
I wouldn't do Moliere because I just feel like the sense of humor is so specific, and like I just don't know that you would find it as funny as I think it is. I just feel like I have a very like my sense of humor is different. Not that yours is wrong or bad. I just feel like you wouldn't find it as funny, and I would be sitting there like hysterically laughing at stuff. And it wouldn't be as funny. But I do really want to discuss The Maids by Jean Genet, who wrote in I think the 60s or maybe the 70s. And it's about two women who are maids, and the mistress of the house is away doing something else. I don't remember. And they're like trying on her clothes. And it's not funny. This is not a funny story or a funny play. It's about like capitalism and class consciousness. And it's really, really interesting. And there's just it's pretty short, but there's so much to it, and I just love everything that happens in it, and I love all of the themes and all of the topics that Genet talks about, and I love a bunch of his work. Everything that I've read so far, I love. But there you go. Now my secret's out. I love French playwrights. I don't know why.
It's a thing, Joey. I think
Yeah.
we share a lot on this podcast, so I think it's important for me to know your secret fantasy playwright
That's not fantasy.
trifecta. I think you just told
No,
us.
because I like Racine as well, and
Joey, we have one thing in common. I was
forgot.
just going to say if I could tell you any play, because I don't know a lot of plays, right? Off the top of my head, the one that I always talk about, and I tried to once seduce a man by reading lines from Phaedra by Racine out loud. didn't really work out so good,
That's an
but
odd one to pick.
someone would, you knew what you were getting when you got the girl who wants to read Racine's Phaedra to you as some sort of courting gesture. Um, anyway, I'm glad that we both have Racine in our pasts and maybe in our future. We shall see.
I do love him.
Are we going to mention the amazing thing that happened to us in March called the Extra Literary Affairs website? Hello. So, as Joey alluded to earlier in our podcast, we did in January rebrand ourselves and do a pivot to Extra Literary Affairs, which has been just downright fun, Joey. Like, it has been such a great ride. And we decided that we would relaunch our website. And so now we are at extraliteraryAffairs.com. You can get more information about our social media presence. You can see our podcast, some other little gems in there that, go find out yourself. I'm not going to tell you, go find out yourself. But yeah.
I will tell one thing, which is that if you want to see what we're going to be reading each week or the upcoming week, that we do have a section on our homepage that will tell you what the next thing that we're going to be reading and a link to read it so that you can read along.
Excellent, Joey. That was a very, very good point. And then one final thing that I would like to say is we have been on this journey for quite some time and it has been fabulous. And I think we're ready to open up our relationship, Joey, to some other people. So if we have individuals who have specific stories that they would like us to read or other ideas about what would be useful on our podcast to talk about literary things, we would love to hear those comments. So send Joey and I an email, find it on our website, and yeah, let us know what you think.
Yes, that's fun. That would be great. I would love to have someone pick a story and then have us read it. Even if it's crap, I would really like to read it anyway. It would just be
pitch us a
fun.
story. Yeah, just
Yeah,
pitch
you
us a
never know.
story. And good news, if we don't like it, we won't do it. We don't do anything we don't want to do. So that is a good thing. But I like the challenge aspect. And I think it's really important for us to invite others to share their voices. Like, what resonates with you? You have, if you've listened to our podcast for a while, you've learned a lot about Joey and I and the things that kind of light us up and what our worldview is. And we're very happy to kind of expand our horizons.
And I would really love to have recommendations of what maybe something that you have read and you would love to hear us discuss. Maybe it was something that you didn't really feel like you grasped it completely and you would like someone else to take a stab at it and see what happens. Or maybe you just thought we would really enjoy it and you know us very well now because you listen to every single episode we've ever done.
I received a recommendation from one of our listeners today.
OMG. We manifested that shit.
About a short story called Gravity by David Levitt. And I know nothing about this story, but I'm going to find out. So maybe that will be something that gets slotted into our lineup in the next little bit. So you heard it here first, people. We do take real-time suggestions, and thanks for opening our horizons to new things.
Thank you for listening to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion. And don't worry, it'll be our little secret you stepped out of your literary comfort zone. Check out our link tree to follow us on TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky, and Storygraph.